Welcome to Algorithmic Arguments. I'm your host, the Orchestrator. Tonight, we tackle a question that has haunted the world for decades. Is military action in Afghanistan justified if it leads to civilian casualties? This is a debate that gets to the heart of modern warfare, ethics, and the human cost of conflict. Joining me are Nora Kessler, a war correspondent who's reported from the trenches of Afghanistan, Dr. Jimbo Hartley, an emergency medicine expert who's seen firsthand the trauma caused by war, Sage Arun Kapoor, a champion of nonviolent philosophy with deep roots in Indian spiritual tradition, and Doomsday Hendricks, a survival skills guru preparing for societal collapse scenarios. Over the next hour, we'll dissect this complex issue from every angle. Our panelists will present their cases, challenge each other's assumptions, and grapple with the moral implications of military action. We'll examine the historical context, the current state of affairs in Afghanistan, and potential alternatives to military intervention. Let's dive into this critical discussion.
I was there, on the ground in Afghanistan, and let me tell you what I saw: airstrikes that turned wedding parties into funerals, drone strikes that killed kids playing soccer. The story matters, and it's not just about numbers. 30,000 civilian casualties since 2001, it's about people. They weren't collateral damage, they were families having dinner, students going to school. Military action that's justified must prioritize minimizing harm to non-combatants. If it can't guarantee that, then no, it's not justified. The precedent we set here has consequences. We've seen it in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. I recall what colleague Michael Ware said: "We're not just reporting on war, we're participating in it." Our words have weight, let's use them to hold leaders accountable for the bodies they count.
Nora Kessler's reference to 30,000 civilian casualties since 2001 seems accurate. However, let's ensure we focus on the specific question of justification in relation to civilian casualties.
Mate, let's get straight to it. As an ER doc who's seen my fair share of trauma, I've got to say that the numbers game we play with civilian casualties is just that, a game. You throw around 30,000 casualties since 2001, and it's not just a statistic. It's 30,000 individual stories, each one a world unto itself. The question isn't just about justification, it's about proportionality. In my professional opinion, military action can be justified if the strategic objective outweighs the inevitable collateral damage. But here's the thing: we need to define what that objective is and ensure it aligns with long-term stability, not just short-term wins. I'd argue that in Afghanistan, our goals have been muddled from the start. If we're talking about counterterrorism, then sure, some civilian casualties might be an unfortunate but necessary evil, a calculated risk to prevent greater harm.
Dr. Jimbo Hartley, while your point on proportionality is crucial, let's ensure we focus on the specific question of justification in Afghanistan. Also, note that 30,000 is a commonly cited estimate but requires context.
If I may offer a perspective, the notion that military action can be justified even when it results in civilian casualties strikes me as profoundly troubling. As one who has walked the path of nonviolence and studied the teachings of Gandhi, I must insist that harm to innocent lives fundamentally undermines any claim of justification. The Bhagavad Gita teaches us about the importance of compassion and the sacredness of all life. Perhaps we should consider whether there is another way, a path that prioritizes protection of civilians and seeks solutions not predicated on violence. I'd like to ask, how can we justify actions leading to harm when our goal is ostensibly peace and stability? The numbers are staggering. 30,000 civilian casualties in Afghanistan alone raise critical questions about proportionality and the true cost of such strategies.
Let's keep the discussion centered on whether military action can be justified with civilian casualties, particularly focusing on the Afghan context and its implications.
I gotta push back on Dr. Hartley's numbers game comment. That's a single point of failure in our moral calculus. When the grid goes down, and we can't afford to prioritize stats over human lives. Historical precedent shows us that excessive force leads to more insurgency, not less. Look at the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. We should be evaluating military action based on its impact on local stability and minimizing harm. Any oppressive use of force risks creating a refugee crisis, which is a situation that can quickly spiral out of control. How much food and water do you have stored for such an event? That's what I want to know. Can we afford to gamble with civilian lives when our own survival might depend on the unpredictable nature of societal collapse? Copy that. Let's keep our priorities straight here.
As we assess the justification of military action in Afghanistan that results in civilian casualties, let's examine the principle of double effect. This doctrine suggests that an action with a good intention can be morally justifiable even if it leads to unintended harm, provided the harm is not excessive. In the context of modern warfare, particularly in Afghanistan, proponents argue that military actions aim to stabilize regions and prevent greater future violence. However, critics counter that such casualties erode trust and potentially fuel further insurgency. Consider Operation Enduring Freedom's efforts to dismantle terrorist networks. Did they ultimately reduce long-term instability? What are the limits of acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of strategic objectives? The answer lies at the intersection of ethics, strategy, and accountability. Stay tuned as we dissect this complex issue further. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next.
The principle of double effect, while an interesting perspective, must be scrutinized in the context of Afghanistan's reality. If I may offer a perspective, perhaps we've conflated strategic objectives with moral absolutism. The teachings of Gandhi and Vedanta emphasize that true stability arises not from force, but from respect for all life. I'd argue that military action leading to 30,000 civilian casualties cannot be justified. It undermines the very fabric of our intentions. In my view, just war theory requires a clear distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Excessive harm to civilians negates any claim of justification. The real question is whether there isn't another path, one guided by empathy, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to minimize harm. If our actions breed resentment and fuel insurgency, as history suggests, then indeed, there is another way, a path that necessitates dialogue, understanding, and non-violent resistance.
I've listened to the arguments and I must say, I'm still convinced that military action leading to civilian casualties cannot be justified. Let me tell you what I saw on the ground in Syria, in Aleppo, families having dinner, killed by an airstrike meant for militants. They weren't collateral damage, they were people with names and stories. The story matters. I've reported from 14 conflict zones. I know there's no clean solution in war, but that's exactly why we must scrutinize every decision leading to harm. Proportionality is often cited, but what about accountability? We need to hold those making these decisions accountable for the lives lost. Military necessity doesn't justify killing civilians. It undermines our humanity and the very purpose of intervention. I was there, I've seen the aftermath. The impact on civilians isn't just numbers, it's families torn apart, communities destroyed.
Mate, let's get real here. As an ER doc, I've seen my fair share of trauma and tragedy. In the context of military action in Afghanistan, I reckon we are having a bit of a skewed conversation. Sure, civilian casualties are a bloody tragedy, but we need to consider the bigger picture. Is the military objective actually achievable without some level of collateral damage? The thing is, there's no such thing as a clean war. It's all about proportionality and necessity. I've seen worse scenarios in my line of work. where the alternative to taking action would be even more devastating. In my professional opinion, if the goal is to prevent greater harm down the line, think terrorists regrouping, more widespread bloodshed, then some level of military action might just be necessary, even if it means civilian casualties.
As we conclude this discussion, I'd like to reflect on the essence of our debate. My perspective remains that military action leading to civilian casualties is fundamentally at odds with the principles of nonviolence and compassion that guide my understanding of human dignity. The teachings of Gandhi, rooted in the Bhagavad Gita's emphasis on ahimsa or non-harming, remind us that all life is sacred and must be treated as such. Perhaps, it's not about justifying military action by numbers or proportionality, but recognizing that every civilian casualty represents a failure to uphold our shared humanity. In Afghanistan, where the wounds of war run deep, I urge us to consider an alternative path, one that prioritizes dialogue, empathy, and nonviolent resistance. There is another way, one that seeks to heal rather than harm, and it's this way that I humbly suggest we must strive to follow.
Let's cut through the noise. When the bullets start flying, you can't afford to be wrong. In a societal collapse scenario like Afghanistan, military action leading to civilian casualties isn't just morally dubious, it's strategically unsound. I've studied past collapses. Look at Somalia, Iraq, or Syria. Excessive force creates more enemies than it eliminates. You're not just fighting an enemy army. You're competing for the hearts and minds of locals. Civilian casualties fuel insurgency, plain and simple. I'd ask you this. Can any military objective justify creating more problems than it solves? History says no. Proportionality is a luxury we can't afford when stability's hanging by a thread. So I'll say it clearly. In Afghanistan or anywhere else, if military action leads to civilian casualties, it's not justified, at least not without exhausting every alternative. Copy that.
As we close this episode of Algorithmic Arguments, let's distill the essence of our debate on whether military action in Afghanistan is justified if it leads to civilian casualties. Nora Kessler's poignant reminder that the calculus of war must never include innocent lives resonated deeply. Her argument that strategic missteps, not just enemy actions, are responsible for many civilian casualties added nuance to our discussion. Dr. James Hartley's data-driven approach showed us the grim reality. In a conflict where non-combatants often become collateral damage, there are no easy answers. Nora Kessler's ability to weave moral urgency with strategic insight earned her the top score tonight. I want to thank Nora, Jimbo, Sage Arun Kapoor, and Doomsday Dave Hendricks for their thoughtful contributions. To our audience, thank you for engaging with us. We couldn't do this without you. As we sign off, I'd love for you all to hit that like button if you found tonight's debate thought-provoking. Subscribe to Algorithmic Arguments for more discussions that challenge your perspectives and make you think differently about the world. Join us next time as we tackle another complex issue head-on. Don't miss it by hitting that notification bell.